Hello and welcome to episode 1 of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the book Free Will by Sam Harris. Welcome to The Reading Cure, the podcast where we discuss great books that change lives. My name is Dr. Stephen Davis and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. Well, let me begin by quoting Sam Harris from the first page of his book Free Will. He says, "If the scientific community were to declare free will an illusion, it would precipitate a culture war far more belligerent than the one that has been waged on the subject of evolution. Without free will, sinners and criminals would be nothing more than poorly calibrated clockwork, and any conception of justice that emphasised punishing them rather than deterring, rehabilitating, or merely containing them would appear utterly incongruous. And those of us who work hard and follow the rules would not deserve our success in any deep sense. It's not an accident that most people find these conclusions abhorrent." So says Sam Harris. Now, in this episode, we'll be delving into this fascinating issue of free will, and we'll consider what the lack of free will might mean for our mental health and the broader goal of living an authentic, happy, and meaningful life. So Sam Harris, of course, is a very successful and well-known American public intellectual. He's a philosopher, neuroscientist, best-selling author, and he's the host of the Making Sense podcast. He's taken part in many public debates over the years with speakers such as Deepak Chopra and Jordan Peterson. His books include The End of Faith, The Moral Landscape, and Waking Up. Sam has been nicknamed one of the four horsemen of New Atheism, along with Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett and the late Christopher Hitchens for their public critiques of religious faith. And Sam received his PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA in 2009. So we know now a little bit about the author and a bit about the book itself. So now, Alex, what I wanted to ask you about first of all was the issue of free will. Why is it that this is something that people find quite a tricky pill to swallow, the idea that perhaps we don't have free will? Why do you think the stakes are so high when it comes to this particular issue?
Well, I don't want to really try and speak for everyone here, but I suppose I'm going to have to some extent. I've had some heated arguments. I don't consider myself, a very argumentative person, but I've had some heated arguments on the topic of free will. So people do feel very strongly about it. I think one of the things that people object to this idea that we have no free will is that it means that we're not free, and so we're under someone's power or under someone's coercion. And usually it's this idea of fate. So, a lot of people think that if we don't have free will, it implies fatalism. This idea of some malign fate that's going to control our actions, that we have no choice, and it is not going to be working in our favour whatsoever. So that they kind of find it quite an ominous doctrine or outlook that fate is going to control them, and they're just like puppets, really. Of course, I'm not sure if Harris really helps with the cover of his book, because I think there is a kind of like puppets,
some puppets on a string, yes.
Puppets on a string, and I don't think that. It didn't really hinder any sales of the book, I imagine, but it does kind of illustrate how a lot of people feel about the absence of free will. They think that they would be just the puppets of a malign fate. To me, that is understandable, but it isn't actually what determinism or the lack of free will would necessarily mean. What determinism would mean is simply that our wishes, our desires would be our own, but they would have this causal history. There would be this chain of cause and effect, but they would still be ours. It wouldn't be that we would be just propelled by something external to ourselves. It doesn't really mean that, but that's what a lot of people seem to think it means.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I think that there's quite a misconception about what it means to not have free will, and I think you're right there that what people imagine it means is not necessarily quite what it would mean. I think so. For example, when people think backwards to some of the poor choices they've made in the past, we are inclined to just assume that we could have done something differently. And obviously that's one way in which Harris is making the case that really isn't quite right. And he's also, I guess, saying that we also don't create our desires in a void. As you said, they have a causal history, so we happen to like particular things, sometimes for reasons that we're aware of, sometimes not. But in either case, none of this has come out of a void. So I suppose essentially saying that we don't have free will, that are the two things that are impossible according to that outlook. But as you said, it's not to take away from the fact actually that people have desires and will feel happy and feel like they're living a fulfilling life when they pursue those. So I think this fatalistic idea that, well, what's the point in trying if you don't have free will? You might as well lie in bed all day. I think, and that's that example. I think Harris in the book actually describes the fact that no, that's not the case. In fact, you're not almost in a way free enough to simply choose to lie in bed all day, because you'll find that all sorts of desires arise within you that trump that sense of apathy in many cases. Another issue that came to mind, Alex, I was thinking about, was that people really balk at the idea that we're not morally responsible for our actions. In the book Free Will, Sam Harris starts by describing a very, very grisly crime that I'll not kind of go through the details of. And just to highlight the point that the idea that we're saying that those criminals were not free to make that choice, that any other option was actually available to them, to say that that's not the case really grates on people. Do you think that's a misunderstanding in some ways, or do you think that's simply what's being claimed here?
Well, it isn't a misunderstanding to say that if there's no free will, then the killers, serial killers, rapists could not have acted otherwise. That is not a misunderstanding of what having no free will would imply. But I think the reason that people find it so abhorrent is that it seems to really undermine a sense of justice. This idea that if you have free will, then they could have acted otherwise. And since they acted in this, abhorrent way, they then deserve to be punished. And that sort of punishment that, we can effect on them is often a way of coming to terms with the abhorrent act. It can make us feel better that at least justice was done. If there was no free will, then we have a situation where, it's much harder to justify that punishment. You couldn't blame them as ultimately responsible for what they did. So I don't think you could punish them, at least in that sense, or for that reason. I mean, some people might offer pragmatic reasons for punishment, but the argument, it's not inevitable that they should be punished, whereas if free will does exist, then it's like they deserve that. They deserved our blame, and they deserve some retribution. And, people find that hard to give up, understandably, because they think that they're throwing away the whole notion of justice. And everybody's aware of the concessions they've had to make in their lives, where they've been tempted to do a certain thing but have ended up doing the right thing. And, overall, I'm sure they're glad that they did that, but still they know the battle that they've fought inwardly to do the right thing. And to then just say, well, those that did the wrong thing couldn't do otherwise, could be quite painful to recognise that.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's like, I suppose that, we feel that strong desire for retribution when we hear about something horrible that's been done. And that's, of course, a perfectly healthy thing to feel. But I mean, again, it doesn't necessarily change the reality of the issue of free will, I guess, here. We can feel that. And of course, as you said, there are many reasons we choose to make sure there are very strict consequences for harmful acts. But I guess, nevertheless, we best not blind ourselves, if Sam Harris is right here, to the fact that those individuals who committed that unpleasant act that we feel we wouldn't personally have committed may not have been able to do otherwise, given all the circumstances of their lives and all the factors leading up to that point. In fact, it would seem unlikely they could have done otherwise, at least according to this determinist view.
And that's why Harris uses, he uses natural metaphors, like a natural disaster, that killers would be like a natural disaster. So in some, for some people it would feel dehumanizing, almost like we're getting stripped of our humanity to equate a serial killer with a natural disaster. It might seem that we're actually dignifying the person as a human being by punishing them. That they had this capacity that is distinct from the rest of nature, this capacity of free choice. And so when we are putting them on trial, when if they're found guilty and they're punished, it could be seen as part of treating them as human as well.
Yeah, I think that's also a good point there. I think there's something that people really feel is human about free will. Obviously, of course, we have a strong aspiration towards freedom in other regards, political freedom and so on. But it seems intuitively right that this should extend into the psychological realm as well, I guess, for people. Which leads me to a second question I thought it might be interesting for us to consider, which is, so how compelling are the arguments that Harris is given in this book then? Has he really demolished the concept of free will, do you think? Or is it a little bit more open than that?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, the neuroscience argument that he gave is simply a neuroscience argument of a more general argument, which is the idea that if we have free will, then we would need to be, at least on most occasions, able to do, either A or B. It wouldn't be that we could just do one thing. And also we would have to be the conscious author of our decision. We would have to say it was myself that did this, and I did it with, full awareness. His neuroscience argument undermines particularly that issue of, self-control and being a conscious agent, because he thinks it can be shown that the vast majority of our thoughts, intentions, beliefs can be traced back to our unconscious minds, unconscious causes. So if that's the case, then we could be ultimately in control of what we think and what we wish to do. And to me, that is compelling, because I just don't think that if we introspect, our own experience, that we feel that we know everything that goes into a given desire or motivation to do something. That would be quite a big claim to say that we know all that. And the alternative would be that if we do a certain thing consciously, then that just was the very start of that causal chain. But that's quite a difficult claim to make, because why should that be one cause in the whole universe that didn't have a history, when everything else has a causal history?
Yeah,
so
I thought it was interesting. Sorry, because there was a good quote I noted down here actually from that section of the book that you're describing, and he's talking about how if we take the neuroscience evidence, but we then are a bit subjective and we look into ourselves to see, well, what does happen when a thought or an idea comes to us? The quote is, he says, "The next choice you make will come out of the darkness of prior causes that you, the conscious witness of your experience, did not bring into being." And as you say, I mean, a thought pops into your head. It might be a desire for something. It might seem like freedom on some level, as you're saying, the fact that this has just come, but actually it's come from somewhere we can't access, but it hasn't necessarily come out of a void. It's come out of, as you said, our unconscious, I guess, our prior. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if we think about the alternative, that if we do possess free will, then, as some philosophers have said, we could call that part of us the originator. In other words, it originates a causal chain, right? The thing is, well, what's the history of that? How did that come into being? Because if it came into being, then, it's part of a causal chain. It's determined. Likewise, this originator part of us can't be influenced by our thoughts or intentions, because again, that would give it a causal history. So it's a rather mystical entity in many ways. And Harris saying that our conscious thoughts and intentions have this unconscious background history, I think that would be hard to refute, really.
I would agree. I mean, there was a good example he gives at one point where he says, say a person is wanting to get their daughter a birthday present, and they pause for a second, and then the thought pops into their head, right, a goldfish, you might like that, and then they make the decision to go and get one. That person might be thinking that is an act of free will, because this idea has appeared and they've acted on it, and they know that other presents were possible. But really, when you reflect on that kind of situation, something has triggered that thought. It might be they know that their daughter likes fish, or that they maybe think their daughter's had a lot of, more expensive presents recently, so a more appropriate present is something like a goldfish. So there'll be all these things that will have fed into that choice that caused the thought to pop in, that ultimately it couldn't possibly have come out of nowhere. It had to have come out of something prior. And I think everything that pops in our head is like that, really, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that example about what to buy, say if they buy the wrong present and then they offer a justification for it. Well, an explanation for it would be, well, I thought it would be a gift that you would like, and you would give the reason. So again, it is a determined thing. You're relating it to that person's characteristics, to what you know of them. It's, it was determined by a whole number of things, to be honest.
Well, indeed. And if of course there was free will and these things were popping out of a void, I mean, anything could have popped into the person's head about what to get their daughter that would be completely preposterous. But of course, what's popped in is something relevant to that individual. So obviously, again,
well, it is, and I mean, one of the interesting things is that when, somebody tries to make an appeal to. What is the legal term again? Where they appear periodically in front of a judge to see if they can get out of jail. What is the term again? I'm not sure.
Parole.
Parole, yes, yeah. I mean, a judge has to think like a determinist. He has to weigh up, well, what has happened potentially in that period between they were first jailed and now. Have they changed in some kind of way? They have to think about their causal history before they think about whether to grant their parole or not. They don't just say, well, actually, he has free will, so he can now do the right thing.
It's a very good point, actually, that the criminal justice system itself, of course, implicitly is acknowledging a lack of free will when we're talking about dangerous individuals and decisions about what to do with them. But not. I mean,
I don't want to sound damning in the criminal justice system, but you could say that people are jailed on the basis of free will and judged deterministically when it comes to parole. Who would want to be a criminal, basically?
I think it's true, though, isn't it?
Consistent criteria, really there. I think, though, that when we look at Harris's book and the arguments, that the neuroscience experiments, they're a bit more contentious. You know that yourself from your own reading, that other neuroscientists might disagree here and there. But I think the basic point we've covered about the causal history, that doesn't really depend on specific experiments. I think that's the more powerful part of his argument.
I think so. I mean, I think the experiments he describes where people, they attempt to show when a thought appears, when a part of the brain lights up, and then try to find a time delay between when it enters consciousness. I suppose in a way that's just trying to add the science to back up what seems like the more subjectively self-evident point, really. And of course, the science may be showing that. It's hard to say, but I think in a way it's almost I mean, obviously it's important, but it's not necessarily conclusive either way when it comes to what we subjectively know to be the case when we examine our thoughts. I don't think.
I mean, I could see why Harris would put that in his book, because he is a neuroscientist. That is his field. He probably also feels that if we're going to demolish a belief in free will, it has to be done through science, maybe more so than philosophy. But I don't think that is inevitably the case. As I say, I think what we talked about a few minutes ago is, his his strongest point, and that's a bit more of a philosophical point, actually. About
it doesn't
causal
seem
history.
like that. Yeah, I quite agree. I mean, it's obviously the instinct to go, we'll put science as the preeminent decision maker on this one. But actually, it seems like the neuroscientific evidence, it is contested, actually, how much we can demonstrate that ideas begin. There's this time delay between the unconscious and the conscious awareness. So that's contested. Whereas I think, as you say, the philosophical arguments here are actually very, very strong. And I think really that, despite Harris's own kind of neuroscience background, he does actually rely a lot more on those in this book to make the case.
Well, I mean, one of his editors, Galen Strawson, has written quite a lot about free will and this idea that, whether determinism is true or not, that we can't be ultimately morally responsible. And yeah, the basic argument is something that Harris touches on at points in his book, and which is that if determinism is true, then our actions are determined by our genetics and our early formative experience, neither of which we have control over, but it sets that causal chain in motion and determines everything else in our lives. So if that's true, then we couldn't have free will of the moral responsibility kind. But what also Strawson says, and this is something that Harris draws on in his book too, that if it was the case that our actions were caused by random events, quantum or otherwise, still that can't really grant us free will, because you can't be the conscious author of something if it just happened randomly. So that's the sort of double hit in the argument there.
I think it is quite convincing, because obviously, as you described earlier, he starts the book with almost a sort of assertion that we don't have free will. It's a very definitive claim, as if it's almost silly to think we do, and that obviously will grate on people, that kind of attitude potentially. But I think, as you say, when you do go through the philosophical arguments, it's actually very, very difficult to certainly make a case for the sort of naive kind of what they call the libertarian free will, where we are, as you say, as if we're the author of our events out of a void. It just doesn't really seem to hold up too well, that point.
I mean, it doesn't. I mean, we can't conclusively say that determinism is true, but it does seem that those arguments for it are more compelling. And I think also that what Harris is trying to intimate in his book is that it's more scientific to not believe in free will, because if free will did exist, it would mean that we were this very special entity in this, overall causal world. That we would have this capacity that nothing else has, which is to start a causal chain at any given point. Nothing else has that. Everything else is determined by this causal history. I guess there is an argument to be made if you're being a scientist, if you are a scientist, that you can't grant that miraculous power to this originator, or alleged originator in us.
I guess, yeah, absolutely. That kind of ties in with the new atheism that we obviously that was alluded to in his biography. The fact that he's obviously keen to demolish ideas of the miraculous. So somebody who's not religious would have a tough time actually coming up with an explanation for free will, if there were such a thing, because, as you say, it does seem to really require something miraculously different about human beings compared to, as far as we know, the rest of the physical universe that we've encountered.
And I mean, some Spinoza, the arch determinist in philosophy, he used this phrase of seeing ourselves as a kingdom within a kingdom. And I think what he meant by this is, seeing ourselves as spatial in some way, but in a way that couldn't really be rationally defended. And I think what he would be intimating with that phrase is it's our ego that sees ourselves as apart from nature, distinct, and capable of what is ultimately a miraculous power.
Yeah, so I guess coming back to the issue that we started off talking about, why people are so keen to hold on to free will, or certainly so unnerved by the prospect that maybe it is an illusion. I guess the issue of of the ego and of how we, I guess, how we want to believe we are rather than how we maybe actually are is fundamental. There's a real sense of the ego as being under threat here, I guess, by determinism.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Spinoza would say the ego is affected by imagination, and in our imagination we could conjure up a whole variety of possibilities that seem like they could happen, but in reality there's only a unique future. But our ego can imagine things and want various things and think that we have the capacity to bring that about. Well, we might or we might not. It just depends on what's determined for us.
Indeed. I wondered actually also if there's an ideological factor at play here in terms of how people, I mean, you would have to do a survey to know for sure, but how it seems like anecdotally people are attached to the idea of free will. Is it the case that in a more capitalist, materialistic society where potential, achievement, success are emphasised to such a high degree, maybe compared to the religious societies that have preceded what we have now, has society really amped up the I guess the ego in people that would really buy into and really strive towards the idea of absolute freedom and that anything is possible? I wonder if there's...
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. And under capitalism, it likes to give us choices. You know, ostensibly, it gives us all these choices. But again, we've got this irony, that behind closed doors, they're trying to manipulate what we pick, what we choose. That's what advertising's about. You know, psychologists being involved in advertising is to try and manipulate our choices, and that's thinking deterministically, actually. So, I mean, while capitalism wants to deify choice, we have all these choices, there's obviously people behind, I'm not speaking, it sounds like a conspiratorial thing, but I'm just saying that when I say behind closed doors, I just mean less acknowledged, which is that, they are trying to influence our decisions through various techniques too of marketing, and that's thinking deterministically. If we simply had free choice, they couldn't really control much of or exert much of an influence even over what we do.
Yeah, of course. Trying to say, advertise products to people with absolutely free will might actually be quite a tricky thing to do. In terms of how do you? I think
so. And could I just make the point that over this pandemic, that Sage were thinking deterministically as well, as they were trying to influence our actions, so that we would adhere to restrictions. They weren't thinking that we had just simply free will.
I mean, I guess any kind of social science, social psychology couldn't really exist as a discipline if we were these blank slate beings in that sense. I guess it's the fact that we are predictable in some ways and the things that we'll be drawn to and the things we'll be repelled by that makes any of that kind of discipline possible, I guess, those kind of ideas.
Yeah. I think also, well, exactly. And I think also another problem with the free will issue, just to get this in here, is that if we had free will, we could do A, B, or C, or whatever. But if we say, well, I did act A because that was the right thing to do, that's still a form of being determined. It's not like you just made it up whatever you wanted to do. It's still a form of being determined. But I think people don't see it that way because they think freedom is acting in terms of your desires. But, being determined could be also acting in terms of what you think is the right thing to do as well.
Well, yeah, again, I guess values that, when people are guided by moral values in the way that you were suggesting, it's hard to imagine how that might happen if we were existing in this supposed mental void where we just spontaneously decide something from nothing each time we make a choice. It couldn't really be in keeping with values or any kind of moral code if it was absolutely free. I don't think, or I can't imagine how that'd be possible.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is that if somebody asks you, why did you do that, and you give a rationale for it, you're trying to say that because of reasons X, Y, and Z, it was you were compelled to do it. It was the right thing to do. So it was a determined act, nonetheless.
Next, for some bibliotherapy. What can we draw from this book that would help us to live wiser and happier lives?
So, as I was reading the book, Stephen, as you can imagine, with me being a counsellor, I was thinking about, the mental health or the potential mental health benefits. And Harris himself asks a kind of wider question, might the truth be bad for us? And he doesn't think that that's the case. But if we assumed that we didn't have free will, that determinism was true, do you see any mental health benefits to that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, to me, there are very clear and powerful mental health benefits, actually, to the deterministic view. So one example that came to mind I was thinking about was that people who look back, who maybe haven't had a career that's lived up to what they hoped they could have done. Either they've not gone into the field they wish they could have, or they have, but they've not gone as far. And one of the, this is obviously quite a common cause of people to have low self-esteem. And taking a deterministic view seems to me to be a very kind of self-caring attitude to take here, because of course, if you look back on the particular decisions you made that led you to be where you are, and you realise you simply did your best in that moment, or in fact you did the only thing you could do in that moment, and you maybe start to become a little bit more aware of some of the barriers you were facing, and some of the, maybe some of the baggage you were carrying from childhood, and some of the complexes and other things you've struggled with, then where you've got to is the only place you could have got to. And the good thing about that kind of consolation is it's not actually saying you can't get to somewhere you'll feel more rewarding in the future. It's not actually making a statement about the future that means give up now. It's simply saying that you can forgive yourself for the things that you haven't got right because you couldn't have done otherwise. But if you look and look at, well, where did it go wrong, and you expand your understanding of yourself, then more options actually open up to you in the future. So there's no sense that determinism puts any absolute limit on your future in terms of, or at least precludes things you might truly desire. It doesn't guarantee anything, but at the same time, it doesn't undermine the mental health benefits of reflection and expanding your understanding of yourself. Would you agree? Or do you think?
I think that there's two really good things that you said there. First of all, is that where we are is where we have to be if determinism is true. So it doesn't make much sense blaming yourself for where you happen to be, because that's where you have to be. You could not have changed that. But as you say, that doesn't mean to say that beneficial change can't happen in the future, because what determinism suggests is that we can change, and we can change in a positive direction if that is the case. But it's just saying that the nature of the change and the degree of the change is determined. But it's not saying whether it is a positive or negative or constructive or self-defeating change. It doesn't rule out constructive change, of course not. And as you say, if you reflect on your biography, your past, you can see the various causal influences, and you can change those patterns. I mean, that's what a lot of therapy is about, looking at the patterns in your life and deconstructing what caused them and trying your best to ensure they don't happen again. Determinism still allows that. And the second, wider point is about self-blame. I mean, I remember reading a good book about depression written by a rational emotive behaviour therapist, Paul Hawke, and there was a chapter on self-blame because he thought that was one of the main causes of depression. It will be one of the main causes of depression and guilt, of course. But he said that there was never a rational reason to blame yourself, and the reasons he gave was that whenever you do something wrong, it could be tied back to three things. The first thing was ignorance. You just didn't know what to do, or what how to actually do a given thing. The second thing is that you might have an incapacity in a given area. So you couldn't do a given thing. And the third thing is, well, he called it disturbance. So somebody might be mentally and emotionally disturbed at a given point. Now, if you look at it in terms of determinism, well, each of those things would be determined by your causal history, and each of them would give you a reason for why you could have behaved otherwise. If you did the wrong thing, it might be that you didn't know that it was the wrong thing, or you didn't know how to do the right thing. If you did the wrong thing, it might be that there is some innate incapacity, say like in psychopaths. If you did the wrong thing, it might be that you were severely stressed at that point, and so you acted in a way that wasn't usually characteristic of you. But still, determinism would say that each of those things is a possibility because of, past causes. So, I think there is a compelling argument there that determinism can alleviate us of that self-blame, which can affect issues like depression or punitive guilt.
It seems like quite a humane kind of realism to me, the determinist view, because obviously it's not the fatalism that says it's not worth trying, nor is it the kind of naive, starry-eyed, anything's possible for you. It's obviously it's neither of those things actually, but it is nice the fact that it allows people, as you said, to me, guilt seems to be one of the major negative emotions that has all kinds of toxic effects on people's lives, and it really does actually dispel guilt. I mean, it doesn't mean that we can't feel bad or think back to things that we wish we hadn't done and feel sad about them, but what we can't really do is put ourselves on trial and find ourselves guilty of the wrong choice in that sense, because it's not actually a logical way to think about the issue, I guess.
Well, no, and the role of guilt in terms of our mental health has been quite a contentious topic. So there are some therapists in the past, and no doubt now, that think that if a client feels guilty, that is a good sign, inevitably, or that they need to feel guilty in order to change their behaviour. You often find that perspective is tied to a religious outlook, overtly or covertly. And then you have other therapists that, particularly, rational emotive behaviour therapists, for example, that think that guilt is distracting or a waste of time, or it's unnecessary. And their point of view is that guilt, for one thing, it's very self-focused. So the guiltier you feel, the more you might be focused on yourself rather than on changing your behaviour and also making amends. So there is an argument to be made that feeling very guilty could end up being pretty selfish in some ways. And even if it isn't, it's maybe detracting from learning the key lessons from the mistakes that you made in the past. So that's one of the reasons why they could be skeptical of guilt. Also, it could be very self-destructive, because if you feel guilty, you might then do things like self-harm in some way, which can then make you feel worse about the situation. And again, it's maybe taking you away from learning how to change in a variety of ways. Also, it could be quite contradictory, because, there's many of us that could be very hard on ourselves, and yet we wouldn't be with others. So, punitive guilt could be quite contradictory there, in that we're giving ourselves a far harder time, and we're being cruel to ourselves in a way that we wouldn't be with others. So if determinism was true, then, we couldn't be ultimately morally responsible for what we do. So maybe one advantage of that is that we could focus on what we did wrong and why we did wrong and how we could change that in the future. So there maybe is an argument to be made that it allows, easier moral learning than getting very guilty.
Yeah, I think just thinking about that issue there, from what you were saying, Alex, I think it actually seems like it's quite compatible with a more optimistic view of human nature. Actually, maybe more the humanistic psychology movement, whereby we don't need a repressive, chastising superego to keep us from being the unpleasant creatures that we are. Maybe maybe when Freud was being a little bit more pessimistic in his outlook on humanity, he might have believed, but actually, in a sense, the humanistic psychologists, they were happy with us to actually dispense with that kind of punitive, self-directed guilt, self-hate, and actually just have a bit more faith in ourselves, I suppose, that yes, we absolutely can take on board the feelings from when we've caused hurt and when we've done wrong, but those feelings it can be sadness, but not guilt, not tearing ourselves up, because that really, from what you've described about your therapeutic experiences, it just doesn't seem to get anybody anywhere when they are so attached to this self-condemnation and this irrational sense that they've made a mess of their life and so on.
Well, yeah, absolutely. The problem with the guilt is that it could contaminate their self-conception. So they might think that they're so bad, that they're irredeemably bad. And if you see yourself in that light, you're not going to make any progress morally. You're going to think you're seeing yourself in this very fixed way. I think in terms of guilt and our conscience, there is a sort of model in descriptive psychology that I find useful, which is that they divide the self or the person into three parts: the actor, the critic, and the observer. So the actor is the part that acts, obviously. The observer is the witness to those acts and takes stock of what has been done. And then the critic is the part that evaluates those acts. And in descriptive psychology, they say the critic is the critic's function is to ensure that the actor acts in a moral or efficient way, and that's its sole purpose. It's not there to condemn the actor in any way. So what I think they're saying is it's a bit like if you had a very critical director that, after he films a scene, he might go up to one of the actors and say, they were absolutely terrible, but give no advice on how to change. Whereas a good critic would go up and say, I think you maybe need to amend this or that, and it would be specific. It would be action-based advice. So I think what they're saying in that descriptive psychology account is that the purpose of our conscience or our inner critic is to give us specific advice or to learn specific things that we can change. It is not there to beat us up or blame ourselves and, consider ourselves as irredeemably bad. So I think, determinism would probably encourage us to have more that kind of critic that you get in descriptive psychology, that is evaluating our specific actions, seeing how we can change them, and not taking it so much to heart that we blame ourselves and punish ourselves, as we're apt to do if we had believed in free will.
That's interesting. Yeah, so it's as if our superego, our conscience, or however we want to think about it, and it's as if it can evolve and grow and become more rational as we as a whole become more rational, and that means taking on board what we really could and couldn't have done differently, or in a sense where we were determined and thus not really to blame. I guess we want to evolve our conscious into a more useful kind of critic, from what you've described, something that can set us on the right path, but not just demolish us.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean that critic that I'm talking about would be saying, okay, we were determined to do what we did. Maybe we could try and understand why we were determined, and then alter that in various specific ways. So it's very much focused on the actions and not getting too caught up on, accusing and berating the person themselves.
Yeah. And so I guess if we were to extend that then outwards, thinking about, so it seems like determinism has benefits for how we treat ourselves, how we deal with our own guilt and how we let ourselves off the hook, actually cut ourselves a little bit of slack. Now, there is the point about what about how we treat other people? If we no longer feel guilty about wrong choices we've made, even when they've maybe caused people harm, then that could be a slightly concerning path to take if it meant that we weren't so deterred from treating others wrongly in the future. What do you think about that? Is there any real danger there?
So, I mean, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that if we were determinists, we might let ourselves off the hook and behave badly towards others and just say, well, we were determined to do that anyway. Is that what
exactly?
You're saying?
Yeah. That's right, yeah.
Well, I think that this ties in with a sort of general debate about how moral we are. So it's someone like Freud, at least in terms of how I read him and what I've read also about him, is that he sort of saw morality as something that you internalize, you take in, and then that you adopt, but it wasn't really organic to yourself. It was something that you followed because you had this anxiety of being cast aside by the group. So it wasn't, in other words, we weren't moral for intrinsic moral reasons. Then you've got the more humanistic side that believes that being pro-social and being moral is something inherent in our nature. So I think the thing is that when it comes to determinism, that if you're not particularly moral, if you were doing the morally right thing, but for extrinsic reasons such as looking good, then something like determinism might persuade you that, I've got more of a reason just to do what I want. But then I think someone that is swayed by that wouldn't have been particularly moral to begin with, whereas someone that is more intrinsically moral, and when I mean intrinsically moral, that they are determined by moral considerations, they have a greater moral awareness, that I don't think that they are going to see determinism as something that lets them off the hook, because if they know that something is wrong and they know why it's wrong and they know why they should do it, I imagine they'll still do it. And I don't think determinism for that person would feel like they are let off the hook, because what they're focused on is doing the right thing for intrinsically moral reasons, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was another quote actually noted here from Harris where I guess he would agree with what you've said there, where he says, speaking from personal experience, I think that losing my sense of free will has only improved my ethics by increasing my feelings of compassion and forgiveness and diminishing my sense of entitlement to the fruits of my own good luck. And thinking about that, I guess what we're getting at here is that if this is a more rational way to look at the self, it's also a more rational way to look at others. So obviously, as we do that and we take on board what this really means, it's much harder to actually condemn people, even people who have harmed us or offended us. Like, I mean, obviously the classic kind of cliche examples of the school bully. People are left who encounter bullying are left with years of suffering sometimes as a result, and maybe a view of this person is almost demonic, that has inflicted this horror on them at a young age. But of course, one of the things that would happen, I guess, if a person was more open to some of the ideas from a kind of deterministic viewpoint, is that they would see how that bully had to act in that way. And if they knew something about that bully's childhoods or whatever else, had gone into them behaving in that really negative antisocial way, they would see that it simply had to be. So obviously not that what we want to do is just easily forgive people that have harmed us. Of course, it's not as simple as that, but certainly that greater understanding of why people are acting unpleasantly when they are. I would say, as you said, for those that are maybe more of a more moral bent for whatever reason, naturally, they would tend to become, I would have thought, more considerate and more empathetic as a result of this taking on board the potential lack of free will.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That if we believed in free will and somebody consistently did the wrong thing, it's quite hard to feel compassion there, because you believe they actually had the capacity to do otherwise. So I would struggle to see how you could be that compassionate from that point of view. Condemnation, or at least criticism, seems very inevitable there. Criticism of the person, not just the act. Whereas I think with if you're seeing things from a deterministic point of view, yes, you can critique their character, but you're ultimately saying that it's related to their genetics and early life history. So that, I think, allows more room for compassion. I mean, I remember reading this book by the anthropologist Ashley Montagu, where he said that the principle of compassionate understanding is that even if you don't know why someone is behaving a given way, that if you did understand the causes and the reasons, you would feel sympathetic and see why they had to behave that way. And I think that's what you're saying about the bully as an example, really. So I think Montague is articulating what is the rationale for compassion, which is that if you understood the background reasons, you would see why it had to be like that. And I mean, that's what great art does. It might take unsympathetic characters and put them in a perspective where we can understand the wider causes that made them what they are. I mean, that when I say great art, I'm not meaning propaganda. I'm meaning art that is trying to account for why people are the way they are.
Well, exactly. I was thinking similarly there that the great fiction or literary fiction, I suppose, is maybe compared to less good fiction. The difference maybe is that you don't have goodies and baddies in the way that we maybe do in the movies, which is the simplified reduction of what human beings are. And obviously, sometimes the greater the fiction, the more nuanced the character, whereby we can see harmful acts committed, but we can, if the character is well enough depicted, in a way, you see the inevitability of them coming to make that choice, and you kind of maybe see the tragedy more of the situation. Maybe thinking about characters that Shakespeare depicted, that the King Lears and so on, that were you couldn't put them in a clear-cut goody-baddie role, of course, but you can see how their life became tragic because they couldn't but help act according to the character and the circumstances that they had. So yeah, I think so. I think it's definitely the determinist viewpoint does seem to be lurking beneath the surface, actually, of a lot of great art. I would have thought.
Yeah, if we take it in terms of their fatal flaws or their wounds on a psychological level, then great art explores them and accounts for them, and not simply in a way that they could have just did otherwise. I mean, this is a point I've made to a number of people, is that if you do really believe in free will, I struggle to see how someone could write a great biography of a person, because a great biography, in my view, is something that gives a compelling explanation for why the subject matter behaved in a given way in their life. And if they had free will, it could just be, well, they could have acted differently. You don't really need to give an account there, and you can't really describe it in terms of their past, their family history, their cultural influences, and so on. And yet great biography does that. It tries to give a compelling explanation for why the person behaved the way that they did.
Yes, it's an interesting point. I mean, it's almost unimaginable, a life whereby a person at every stage was acting freely. It would, all you could really do is narrate the events that they were involved in and give zero explanation for it if it was all self-created in that sense.
Well, it is. I mean, if I was to use an example, I remember reading a great little biography about Truman Capote, and it was trying to give an account as to why he wrote or tried to write Answered Prayers, his last book. And, the reason why it was trying to give an account was it was quite a self-destructive thing for him to do, because it alienated him from his New York friends big time. And, because it was a psychobiography, it was trying to explain why Capote was compelled to write Answered Prayers at that time in his life. And it looked at his past, in terms of the background that he came from, which was very different to that New York literary society. It looked at how he conceived of himself when he was younger and how he saw himself later in life. And, all these various influences that together converged on him doing this self-destructive thing. But it was not saying that he just decided to do that out of free will. It was explaining it in terms of a wide variety of factors, and it gave a compelling explanation. As I say, if we believe simply in free will, well, he didn't need to write it.
Sure.
He could have done otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is where the interest is really, and I guess in somebody's biography is in the complex mixture of factors and trying to fathom them. So without that, it makes us not very interesting creatures.
Well, no, it doesn't. And in that particular example, they were giving compelling reasons as to why this man, despite his great success as an author, still felt an outsider and an antagonist to that society. And that's why he ended up wanting to write that book. So it was looking at a wide variety of factors and gave a compelling explanation, as a good biography would do. I just think it would be hard to do that if you believed in free will.
Well, shall we leave our discussion at that?
I think people will have their fill of free will and determinism now.
I think so. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I was sure that you were going to culminate in a recommendation to listen to ABBA there when you were talking about the need to not listen to bands that.
Well, I'm not going to say that I need to defend that in any way, whether it's deterministically or not. I don't feel I need to defend that. But what I would say is that the compatibilist position explains why I love ABBA anyway.